Thursday afternoon in the Oval Office, the President of the United States picked up a pen and renamed one of the 5 Great Lakes. Effective immediately, he said. Lake Ontario, a body of water that has carried the name for roughly 400 years, was ordered to be called Lake America by every federal agency in the country. Within hours, the governor of New York had already told him no. That single fact is the whole story in miniature. A president signs an order. A state simply refuses to follow it. And in between those two moments sits a trade war that has been quietly hollowing out farms, factories, and border towns on both sides of one of the longest undefended borders on Earth. This is not a story about a name on a map. It is a story about what happens when a diplomatic relationship that has lasted more than 2 centuries starts to crack, and a governor decides her state would rather stand next to Ottawa than salute Washington. Let's start with what actually happened, because the details matter here more than the headline. According to reporting confirmed by the Washington Post, President Trump signed the executive order on Thursday, August 27th, directing the U.S. Interior Department and the U.S. Board on Geographic Names to update all federal records, so that Lake Ontario would be referred to as Lake America going forward. Canada has been ripping us off for a long time on trade. Very sadly, he said, according to remarks reported by the Detroit News. Even the military. We defend Canada for nothing. We don't get anything. They don't pay us to defend Canada. He went further, according to that same reporting, saying Canadian officials want to be treated like they're a state, and so we just can't do that anymore, and calling Canadian officials nasty people who had treated us very badly. U.S. federal government. It does not bind Canada. It does not bind international mapmakers. It does not even bind individual U.S. states. According to Time magazine's reporting on the story, this is not the first time the president has tried something like this. When he signed a similar executive order last year, renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, that directive also applied only to federal agencies. Other nations kept calling it the Gulf of Mexico. Major outlets that set their own style guidelines, including the Associated Press, largely continued using the original name too. Time also reported that the United States and Canada have a formal 1989 agreement specifically covering how the two countries coordinate names for shared geographic features, a detail that adds a layer of irony to a unilateral renaming of a lake that literally straddles the international border. So why Lake Ontario, and why now? To understand that, you have to rewind slightly, because this did not come out of nowhere. Times reporting places the origin of the Lake America idea a few days earlier than the actual signing. The president had floated the idea, according to that report, after trade talks between the U.S. and Canada collapsed the previous Friday. The very next day, the Trump administration's 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of imported Canadian goods went into effect. On the Tuesday that followed, Canada announced its own retaliatory tariffs, ranging as high as 50% on some products, set to begin on September 8th. Both governments, according to Time, blamed each other for the breakdown in negotiations. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said in a statement that the United States had pushed for last-minute changes to the trade agreement that Canada was not willing to accept. Before moving on, it's worth understanding how the U.S. Board on Geographic Names actually functions, because that mechanism explains why this order, however loudly it was announced, is narrower in practice than the headlines might suggest. That board has existed since the late 19th century, originally created to standardize geographic names across federal agencies, so that maps, weather reports, and government documents don't contradict one another. What makes this case different, according to every outlet covering it, is that Lake Ontario was never in dispute. It wasn't outdated, it wasn't contested by the communities living around it, and no local government had asked for a change. Lake Ontario is the smallest by surface area of the 5 Great Lakes, but don't let that fool you. It still covers about 7,340 square miles, roughly the size of the entire state of New Jersey, according to Newsweek's reporting. It forms part of the literal international boundary between the two countries. On the Canadian side, its shoreline touches major cities including Toronto, Mississauga, Hamilton, and Kingston. On the American side, it borders Rochester and Watertown, New York, and feeds the Niagara River on one end and drains into the St. Lawrence Seaway on the other, ultimately reaching the Atlantic Ocean. According to the Center for Great Lakes Literacy, cited by The Hill, the lake's watershed is home to roughly 6 million Americans and Canadians combined. This is not some remote symbolic body of water. It's the literal water supply, shipping route, and shared backyard for millions of people who live nowhere near Washington or Ottawa, but who are watching this fight play out in real time. And the name itself has history that predates both countries as we know them. According to Carney's own public statement, posted on X and confirmed by multiple outlets, including the Detroit News and Fox News, the word Ontario comes from the Wendat, also called Huron, word Ontario, which, the Prime Minister said, appropriately means the lake is beautiful, the lake is big. Carney pointed out that the name is more than 400 years old, predating both the Confederation of Canada and the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. He didn't stop there. We know that America is changing, Carney wrote. Their trading relationships, their foreign policies, their national monuments, their hydronyms. Then the line that's been quoted everywhere since, Canadians also know that naming reality means calling it Lake Ontario. Then, now, and always. Canadians on the ground echoed that same tone, just with less diplomatic polish. Patrick Brown, the mayor of Brampton, Ontario, told CNN on Thursday afternoon, in comments reported by Newsweek, "We're still going to call it Lake Ontario. The only person who is having trouble with what to call it is your president." He added a comparison that's been repeated across Canadian media since. The whole notion is a bit preposterous, and just like if our Prime Minister wanted to rename the Mississippi River, you'd probably get a chuckle out of it. It is having the same reaction in Canada. Carney's government wasn't just responding rhetorically either. According to Time magazine's reporting on the collapse of trade talks, Canada's retaliatory position had already been building for days before the renaming order landed. Carney's earlier statement, issued after negotiations broke down the previous Friday, accused the United States of demanding last-minute changes that Ottawa considered unacceptable, a claim the Trump administration disputed, with both sides blaming each other publicly for the breakdown, according to that same Time report. That back and forth over who actually killed the negotiations matters, because it means the lake renaming didn't happen in a vacuum of goodwill that suddenly soured. It happened after an already failed round of talks, after tariffs were already flowing in both directions, and after both governments had already spent the better part of a week publicly blaming one another. The lake was, in that sense, the moment this dispute stopped being confined to trade ministries and spilled into something ordinary people, without any economic background, could immediately understand and react to. So that's the Canadian side. Predictable, in a sense. A foreign government pushing back on an American president renaming something inside its own shared border. What's more interesting, and what the title of this video is actually about, is what happened on the American side of that same lake, in New York State, within the same news cycle. Governor Kathy Hochul did not wait long to respond. According to Fox News, on Thursday she posted on X a message that was about as blunt as political communication gets. New York won't be calling it that. 4 words. No qualifiers, no diplomatic hedging, no "we respectfully disagree." Just a flat refusal from the governor of the state that actually borders the lake in question. But Hochul didn't stop at 4 words when reporters asked her to elaborate. According to Yahoo News' compilation of New York officials' reactions, Hochul said the renaming itself was almost beside the point. A distraction from what she considers the real damage being done. The fact that this is even part of the conversation shows how absurd the Trump administration is, she said. They should be focusing on ways to mend relationships with Canada, so our farmers and our consumers and our families do not continue suffering from this inane war over tariffs. She backed that up with a specific, concrete example, rather than just a general complaint. And this is the kind of detail that makes the trade war real instead of abstract. Hochul said a New York apple farmer had recently told her that 40% of the state's apple exports go to Canada. They stop accepting New York state apples in retaliation to us. That hurts an entire industry we have, she said. That's just one small example. 40%. Think about that for a second. Nearly half of an entire agricultural export market dependent on a relationship that is currently being managed through escalating tariffs and now a fight over what to call a lake. Hochul wasn't alone. U.S. Representative Joseph Morelle, a Democrat representing New York's 25th District, which covers Rochester, a city that sits directly on the shore of Lake Ontario, was even sharper in his framing. According to Yahoo News, Morelle called the renaming order an attempted distraction from the president's disastrous trade talks with Canada. His full quote is worth hearing in its entirety. Pretending to rename a lake is an attempted distraction from the president's disastrous trade talks with Canada. While Rochester families deal with the impacts of a trade war he started, President Trump is playing games with a map. Rochester is not some abstract talking point here. It's Morelle's actual district, sitting right on the water that was just renamed, and he's arguing that his constituents are paying the real economic price while the White House manages the news cycle with a map change. Then there's Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who represents New York in the U.S. Senate and has been one of the most consistent national voices criticizing the administration's handling of trade with Canada. According to CBS 6 Albany's local coverage, Schumer's statement read, "Instead of lowering costs and canceling his damaging tariffs, Trump is doubling down on a juvenile effort to rename one of the Great Lakes. He's escalating his reckless tariff war with our closest trading partner and ally, which will continue to drive up costs for upstate New York families, seniors, and small businesses." On X, according to the Yahoo News roundup, Schumer put it even more simply. Sad and pathetic, unable to solve a single problem facing Americans, this is what Trump resorts to. So within the span of a single news cycle, you had the governor of New York, a member of Congress representing a Great Lakes district, and the state's senior senator, all Democrats, worth noting for full transparency, publicly rejecting a presidential order on the basis that it distracts from real economic harm happening to their own constituents. That is, functionally, New York State siding with the position Canada has taken, even if none of these officials framed it explicitly as siding with Canada. They didn't need to. Refusing to use the name and pointing to Canadian trade retaliation as the actual threat to New Yorkers accomplishes the same thing in substance. New York wasn't the only state pushing back either, and it's worth including this because it shows the reaction wasn't isolated to one governor with a political grudge. According to The Hill, Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers, also a Democrat, responded with a stunt that captured plenty of attention on its own. Evers posted a video of himself writing on a McDonald's paper napkin in marker, Lake Wisconsin, followed by his signature with the caption, "And I just renamed Lake Michigan Lake Wisconsin. See, I can sign napkins that say things too." It was mockery, clearly, but mockery with a specific point. That an executive order changing a centuries-old name is, in Evers' framing, roughly as consequential and as legally binding as scrawling something on a napkin. Vermont Governor Phil Scott also criticized the move, according to The Hill's reporting, though Scott is a Republican, which matters, because it shows the pushback wasn't purely partisan. When a Republican governor in a neighboring border state joins Democratic governors and members of Congress in rejecting a presidential order, that's a signal the criticism isn't only about party politics. It's about the practical reality that states bordering Canada, on both sides of the political aisle, are the ones absorbing the economic consequences of this trade fight, regardless of what the lake ends up being called on federal letterhead. There's one more piece of the New York reaction worth including, because it shows this wasn't confined to elected officials issuing carefully worded statements. Local coverage from CBS 6 Albany, reporting from around the state capitol, described the response from New York leaders as swift and largely unified in substance, even when the tone differed from one official to another. Hochul's version was blunt and short. Schumer's was pointed and partisan, framing the order as part of a pattern of what he called reckless economic decision-making. Morelle's was rooted in his own district, naming Rochester specifically because it's the largest American city sitting directly on Lake Ontario's shore, and because his constituents are the ones who would feel any disruption to cross-border trade first and most directly. 3 different officials, 3 different tones, but the same underlying message. The name change itself was never really the issue. It was a symbol standing in for a trade relationship that a lot of New Yorkers feel is actively being damaged, and none of them were interested in pretending otherwise just because the president had signed something with an official seal on it. Let's step back and put some numbers on this trade war, because the tariffs are the actual substance underneath all of this, and the lake is just the symbol sitting on top. According to Times reporting, the 50% U.S. tariffs that took effect covered roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian imports. Canada's retaliatory measures, which Time reported would begin September 8th, range as high as 50% on some categories, and were reported by the Detroit News to cover roughly $20 billion worth of American goods in return, including steel, dairy products, appliances, and farm equipment, according to Newsweek's breakdown. That is not a minor trade dispute over a narrow product category. That is a broad-based tariff war touching some of the most economically significant sectors that flow across the Canada-U.S. border, a border that, prior to this year, represented one of the largest bilateral trading relationships anywhere in the world. And this didn't start with the lake renaming, or even with this round of tariffs. According to earlier reporting cited around the region, Governor Hochul had already been vocal about the economic strain from Trump's Canada tariffs well before the Lake America order. In comments reported by Yahoo News from earlier this year, Hochul said on MSNBC that Canada and New York State are really part of one region, pointing to the Peace Bridge that physically connects Buffalo, New York, to Fort Erie, Ontario, as a symbol of just how integrated the two economies are along that stretch of border. At that point, tariffs of 25% on Canadian and Mexican imports, along with 10% on Chinese goods, had just gone into effect, and Hochul was already warning that our businesses are going to feel this immediately. Her question then, why are we doing this, reads almost like a preview of the frustration that boiled back over months later with the lake renaming. It's also worth remembering that Lake Ontario is only one of 5 Great Lakes, and the entire chain is governed by a dense web of shared agreements between the two countries. Treaties covering water levels, shipping rights, pollution control, and fishing quotas across Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. Those agreements were built up over more than a century precisely because no single country can manage a shared freshwater system unilaterally without cooperation from whoever sits on the other shore. That's part of why a unilateral renaming, symbolic as it may be, lands as more than just a naming dispute to officials who work inside that cooperative framework every day. It's a reminder that one side can, at least rhetorically, act as though the lake belongs to it alone, even when the actual management of the water depends entirely on both governments continuing to work together. Now, there's an older layer of context here that deserves to be included, but it also deserves an honest caveat, because the sourcing on it is weaker than everything else in this script. Reporting that circulated more than a year before the lake renaming, originating with the New York Times and relayed through Canadian outlets like the Toronto Star, described private talks between Trump administration officials and Canadian counterparts in which the president reportedly questioned the validity of the treaty demarcating the U.S. Canada border and reportedly raised the idea of revisiting how the two countries share the Great Lakes and connecting rivers. Then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was reported, via a hot microphone, to have said Trump wanted to annex Canada outright. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick reportedly told a Canadian official that the administration had come to view the entire web of U.S. Canada treaties and agreements as something that could simply be abandoned. I want to be careful with that material because, unlike everything else in this script, it comes from secondhand accounts of private conversations, relayed through unnamed sources, more than a year removed from the events we're covering today. It has never been confirmed on the record by the individuals directly involved, and it should be treated as reported claims from that earlier period, not as established fact. What it does provide, though, is useful context for why a lake renaming order lands so differently on Canadian ears than it might on American ones. If you're a Canadian official who has already heard, even secondhand, that the sitting U.S. president has questioned the legitimacy of the border itself and floated renegotiating how the two countries share the Great Lakes, then an executive order renaming one of those very lakes doesn't read as a quirky gesture. It reads as a continuation of something that was already being discussed behind closed doors. That context also helps explain why Trump's rhetoric toward Canada has included, at various points, suggestions that Canada should become the 51st state, a line referenced in Newsweek's coverage of this story as part of the broader pattern of the president repeatedly taunting Canada since returning to office. Whatever your view of that rhetoric, it's now part of the same continuous narrative that includes $20 billion tariff packages in both directions and an executive order changing what federal agencies call a body of water that both countries have shared, peacefully, for longer than either country's founding documents have existed. So where does this actually leave things, practically speaking, for the people who live around the lake? The honest answer is, not much changes on the ground, at least not immediately. According to Fox News, U.S. states are not bound by the federal order and can continue using Lake Ontario on state signage, documents, and maps if they choose to, which is exactly the position Hochul has already staked out. Canada, as a sovereign country, was never going to be bound by a U.S. executive order in the first place, and Canadian officials, from the Prime Minister down to a Brampton mayor, have made it unmistakably clear they have no intention of adopting the new name. International map-making bodies are under no obligation to change anything either, and given how the Gulf of Mexico renaming played out, with most of the world simply continuing to use the original name, there's little reason to expect a different outcome here. What has changed, or at least what has already changed, is the tone of the relationship. A renaming order that is, in strict legal terms, largely symbolic, has managed to draw public rebukes from a sitting governor, 2 members of Congress, Wisconsin governor with a napkin, a Vermont governor from the opposing party, a Canadian prime minister, and the mayor of a mid-sized Ontario city, all within roughly 24 hours. That's not nothing. Symbols carry weight precisely because people choose to respond to them as though they matter. And in this case, officials on both sides of the border decided this one mattered enough to respond to immediately and publicly. When the Gulf of Mexico renaming happened, according to Times reporting, the pattern was almost identical to what's playing out now. A federal order with real legal force only inside U.S. agencies, immediate rejection by the other country involved, and continued use of the original name by major news organizations, other governments, and most ordinary people going about their lives. If that pattern holds again here, and every early sign from Hochul's statement to Carney's suggests it will, then within a few months, Lake America may exist primarily inside federal databases and official U.S. government correspondence, while everyone living around the actual shoreline, on either side of the border, keeps calling it exactly what they've always called it. It's also worth asking the question CTV News and other outlets have been tracking in their live coverage. What happens next? The tariffs Canada announced are scheduled to take effect September 8th, according to Times reporting, which means the economic dimension of this fight is still unfolding, even as the symbolic dimension grabs headlines. Whether the two governments find a path back to negotiations before that deadline, or whether the tariff war deepens further, will matter far more to farmers, factory workers, and cross-border families than whatever a federal database calls a lake. Hochul's Apple example is a small, specific illustration of a much larger pattern. Agricultural and manufacturing supply chains that were built over decades of close economic integration between two countries that, until recently, rarely treated each other as adversaries in any meaningful sense. Before wrapping up, let's be transparent about where all of this information comes from, because that matters, especially on a story with this much political charge attached to it. The core facts of the executive order and the president's remarks come from reporting by the Washington Post, the Detroit News, and Time magazine, all of which had direct coverage of the Thursday signing. New York officials' reactions, Hochul, Morelle, and Schumer, are drawn from reporting by Fox News, The Hill, Yahoo News, and CBS 6 Albany, with direct quotes attributed to each figure's public statements. Carney's response comes from his own public statement, quoted consistently across the Detroit News, Fox News, and The Hill. The Brampton mayor's comments were reported directly by CNN and relayed through Newsweek. Tariff figures, including the $20 billion totals on both sides and the September 8th retaliation date, come from Time magazine and the Detroit News. Background on the Center for Great Lakes Literacy's watershed population estimate comes via The Hill's reporting. The one section of this script that carries a genuine caveat is the older material about alleged private conversations concerning border treaties and Great Lakes agreements. That reporting originated with the New York Times and was relayed through secondary sources more than a year before this week's events, has not been independently reconfirmed as part of this week's coverage, and should be understood as previously reported claims rather than verified current fact. Everything else in this script reflects on-the-record statements, official government actions, or directly quoted remarks from named public officials, confirmed across multiple independent news organizations. It's also worth acknowledging what didn't happen this week, because the absence of certain reactions is almost as telling as the reactions themselves. No Canadian province threatened retaliation beyond the tariffs already announced. No New York official called for anything beyond simply continuing to use the existing name and criticizing the trade war, driving the tension in the first place. Nobody on either side of the border escalated this into a diplomatic incident requiring ambassadors or emergency sessions of Congress or Parliament. That restraint matters. It suggests that even amid genuinely serious economic damage, tariffs running into the tens of billions of dollars, farmers worried about export markets, families in Rochester and Buffalo and across upstate New York bracing for higher costs, both governments and the officials representing the people most directly affected still chose measured public statements over further escalation. Hochul's 4 words, Carney's statement about hydronyms, Evers' napkin, Morelle naming his own district. These are the responses of people frustrated by a symbolic move layered on top of a real economic fight, not the responses of a relationship in genuine diplomatic crisis. That distinction is worth holding on to, especially in a news environment that tends to reward the loudest possible framing of every story. There's a broader question sitting underneath all of this that's worth leaving you with. Renaming a lake doesn't change a single shipping route, a single tariff line, or a single Apple export contract. It doesn't undo 400 years of shared geography or 2 centuries of largely peaceful coexistence along the world's longest undefended border. What it does do is force people, governors, members of Congress, prime ministers, mayors, and millions of ordinary residents on both shores, to decide in real time which version of reality they're going to live in. New York decided within hours. So did Wisconsin. So did Canada. Unsurprisingly, since Canada was never going to call it anything else. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. When a national government makes a largely symbolic move like this, and the states or provinces closest to the ground simply refuse to go along with it, Does that tell you something meaningful about the limits of federal power over lived, local reality? Or is this just noise, a distraction, as Morelle put it, that will be forgotten the moment the next headline arrives, while the tariffs quietly do the actual damage in the background? I'd genuinely like to know what you think, whichever side of the border or the political spectrum you're watching this from, if you want to keep following how this trade dispute develops. What happens when Canada's retaliatory tariffs actually take effect on September 8th? Whether New York's agricultural sector absorbs the impact Hochul described, and whether Lake America ends up anywhere outside a federal database. Sticking around for the next update is the easiest way to see it unfold as it happens, since stories like this one tend to move fast and change shape within days. There's more coming on how this affects the actual people living along that shoreline, not just the officials issuing statements about it. And if this kind of grounded, source-by-source breakdown of a fast-moving political story is useful to you, staying subscribed means you won't have to go looking for the next piece of it. It'll just be here when it happens. One last thing worth putting in perspective before we close. This is happening against a backdrop most Americans and Canadians would have found almost unimaginable a decade ago. The United States and Canada share the largest bilateral trading relationship most of their citizens have ever known, built on integrated supply chains in agriculture, automobiles, energy, and manufacturing that cross the border sometimes several times before a finished product ever reaches a store shelf. Border towns like Buffalo and Fort Erie or Detroit and Windsor function almost as single economic units split by an international line that, for most of modern history, barely felt like a border at all in daily life. That's the relationship currently absorbing 50% tariffs in both directions. And it's the same relationship a lake renaming order just became the latest flashpoint for. Whatever you make of the name on the map, the lake itself isn't going anywhere. And neither, it seems, is this fight.